Become a sustaining member of the Commonwealth Club for just $10 a month. Join today.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's virtual program at the Commonwealth Club of California. My name is Jennifer Palmieri. I'm the former White House Communications Director and the co-host of the Showtime documentary series, The Circus. And I'm excited to be here moderating this program today. I'm very pleased to be joined by my friend Ben Rhodes to discuss his new book, After the Fall, Being American in the World We Made. As a White House staffer, Ben was the Deputy National Security Advisor for Strategic Communications and Speechwriting under President Barack Obama. He spent his career managing international conflict, particularly in the conversations that led to Obama reestablishing diplomatic relations with Cuba. Now his book, After the Fall, documents his 3 years of world travel where he spoke with politicians, activists, and dissidents, confronting the same nationalism that has been tearing America apart. Our nation has faltered, and according to Ben, the acceptance of unrestricted capitalism after the Cold War, post 9/11 nationalism, mania for technology and media, and modern racism that Americans refuse to confront have all contributed to our weakened nation. He wonders why nations have opted for populism and tyranny over democracy, and today he may provide us with an answer. We'll be discussing a lot in the next hour, and I want to ask your questions too. If you're watching along with us, please put your questions in the text chat on YouTube, and we will get to them about 45 minutes into the program. Thank you, Ben, for joining us.
Thank you so much, Jen, for doing this. The best part about writing a book is you get to catch up with your friends at events like this.
I know, it's sad.
It's sad.
I haven't seen you. I haven't seen you in person in a long time.
Yeah,
but this is good. You know, this is better than not.
I saw you in a studio in LA, I think, for your podcast.
Yes, I mean that was a long time. That was a really long time ago. A lot has happened. Has happened. So we were chatting beforehand, but I just want to vouch that. The book is really, it's not just good and well written. I think it's really important for people to read because, I think like a lot of people were the last 4 years, I was focused solely on America, very inward looking. And among the things that this book does, it forces you outside of America to look at these nationalist trends globally, how America has contributed, how that happened in America, how America's contributed to it, what America needs to do now. And so I just think it's important for people to take time to consider that piece of this puzzle, because when we focus just on America, you get lost in it.
Yeah.
But I want to start about, since Putin is coming, Putin and Biden will be meeting on Wednesday in Geneva. And he gave an interview to Keir Simmons at NBC. And so I just want to get your reaction to that, what you think the setup is going to be going into that interview, what President Biden should, into that meeting, what President Biden should do in it.
I mean, I think, I had to, in the process of writing this book, because I look at kind of how this nationalism and authoritarianism has taken root in different places, and Russia is obviously one of those places. And in doing that, I had to kind of inhabit the entire Putin story back to the 90s.
Yeah.
And when you do that, and I did it kind of through the perspective of, Russians who've been on the other end of Putinism, Alexei Navalny, who's obviously in prison now, a young woman named Zhana Nemtsova, whose father was assassinated in the shadow of the Kremlin. He had been a Putin oppositionist, but then also looking at my own experience. And I think we have to recognize where Biden is now, Putin is kind of in late stage corrupt autocrat in the sense that he's just gotten steadily more aggressive, so he comes to power at the very end of the 1990s, and it's a kind of a reaction against the trauma of losing the Soviet Union, the kind of complete chaos of the privatization of the entire Soviet Union, basically to a handful of pretty corrupt oligarchs in the 90s, anger about that, a sense that the place just wasn't being run efficiently after having this intense state control. And there's these phases to Putin. And phase one is him kind of putting his arms around the system, consolidating control, pursuing an autocratic playbook of seizing power essentially piece by piece in ways that I think we've seen replicated in other places. He's also,
what time frame was that?
So this is his first time as president. It's kind of like 2000 to 2008.
Right.
And by the end of that, there's been high oil prices. So like standards of living are up in Russia. He's feeling pretty good. He's beginning to push back against the United States. He invades his neighbor, Georgia. And that happens in 2008. And then he kind of takes a step back and Dmitry Medvedev becomes the front man. And by the time Putin returns, there's not the high oil revenues. Things are a little tougher post-financial crisis in terms of being able to rely on just juicing the economy. And there's this kind of real turn towards a more virulent nationalism from Putin because he needed some legitimacy. And it used to be he could spread the money around. Well, then it became, I'm going to turn to things like an invasion of Ukraine. I'm going to turn to a much more aggressive foreign policy. I'm going to try to go on offense and really destabilize America and the West. And that's been what Putin's been doing ever since he returned to power. And by the way, I'm just going to discard any semblance of democratic norms here. And I'm just extending my term basically forever. And at the same time, we also have to remember he's like one of the richest people in the world. He's stealing from the Russian people furiously, him and his circle. And so the reason I say that all to set it up is that like, he's not going to change. I mean, he's been, we've got 20 years of this guy getting worse, getting more aggressive. It's good that they're having a summit. As you know, Jen, I think keep lines open. Maybe you can salvage some cooperation on, you want to have discussions about nuclear weapons, right? About the Iran nuclear deal, about trying to put some, guardrails around all this cyber activity that's taking place. But in terms of like what to expect, you're going to get Vladimir Putin being essentially a troll and being someone who wants to divide Americans against each other, wants to divide America against our allies, is going to continue to, repress his opposition at home. That's not going to change. And I think Biden has to have that, and I think he does, that awareness of like, there's a limit here to what can be accomplished beyond just keeping the communication lines open.
But it's important that he confront. You think that it's important that Biden sees him, that Biden confront him. I mean, they seem to be going into this, like when Jake Sullivan, the national security advisor, did his setup briefing for this in the White House last week. I mean, he was, for Jake in particular, relatively pugilistic about this. Like some people said you shouldn't reward Putin by meeting with him now. And Jake's like, this is not a reward. We're going to, he didn't use the word confront, but it seems that they feel the need to show that the United States isn't going to be bullied by him.
Yeah. And I think that matters in the sense that, look, China and Russia are not shy about, commenting on, reacting to, acting on their opposition to American democracy.
When we saw that in China, with the meeting with China that happened in Alaska.
Yeah, I thought that was
Blinken and Jake.
Yeah, that was great. I mean, I think it's time to just kind of go in here and be like, guys, like, here's what we believe, and here's what we believe about what you're doing. I think in terms of like what can be done, some people say what can possibly be done to put more pressure on Vladimir Putin. We already have all these sanctions. That's true. Part of what can be done is just being more open about, hey, I'd like to see them look at publicizing how corrupt this guy is. I mean, That's what Navalny did. I mean, the reason Navalny was such a threat to Putin, that's what he did. I mean, he was basically an investigative journalist with an online platform and a national organization who just exposed corruption and built an enormous political following in doing it. The reason that he's in prison in part is that Vladimir Putin finds that threatening. Well, I think the United States can probably figure out how corrupt Vladimir Putin and his circle is and be open and public about that. We can also do more, I think, Jen, to like crack down on the way in which they use our own financial system to finance their corrupt rule. Like where do you think the money's laundered? I mean, and I write in the book about like, you look at these giant towers going up in New York City that nobody lives in. Well, there's some Russian money washing through there, just like it's washing through London. So there's things that we can do. I don't want to suggest that it's going to, fundamentally change the course of Vladimir Putin's reign in the immediate term. But it matters in the long run because these are deep contests inside of all of our societies. In Russia, the Navalny the group of Russians that support Alexei Navalny, they want to know that there's solidarity with them around the world. They want to know that people, that they're not going insane for thinking that things can change, right? And part of what America has to get back to is this kind of patient, steady support for people struggling for their rights in the most extreme and difficult circumstances.
Patient, steady support, right? There's so much on our side has to be focused, but take place over the long term, and like pushing against a lot of it's not easy to be the anti-authoritarian. It's not efficient or easy.
Yeah. And one thing I thought about in kind of telling this Russia story in the book, and then obviously in the China story too, but like Putin, in 2000, when he became president, nobody would have bet that 20 years later, the United States would be a complete mess and Putin would be this strong man kind of bestriding the world stage. He worked at it for 20 years. He stayed relentlessly focused on a very particular vision of a kind of nationalist authoritarian system in Russia and an undermining and unraveling essentially of the international order globally. And we don't have that, we like the swings in our politics since 2000, if you think about it. I mean, we don't have that kind of sense of identity that like, there's just things that we're going to do because we're America. And one of those things is we're going to speak up against people like Vladimir Putin and on behalf of people, who are fighting for democracy. In a weird way, like, I mean, yes, of course we do it, but like we do it with the context of like swinging from a Bush to an Obama to a Trump to not taking that set of issues as seriously as we take issues here in the United States, to a news cycle that demands that you solve problems, tomorrow in the summit. Right. We just, in the Cold War, there was something. It's not that we had it perfect, but we'd all agreed that there was this kind of identity for what and I really kind of, looked inward in writing this book about what did I think being American meant. And I realized that until the fall of the Berlin Wall, it meant that we were on the free side and that the other guys were the bad guys and that they were for communism. And that wasn't, I know that was oversimplistic, but it did put some guardrails up in terms of what
kept America focused on that as the enemy as opposed to each other.
Each other, exactly. And a Trump is impossible in the Cold War. Like they would not have allowed, no political party would have entertained that, and I think a lot of what this book is about is the excesses of once you're on top, you don't, it's like in life, Jen, like you don't curb your own behavior sometimes when you're flying too close to the sun. And we've kind of been that person who forgets to check themselves and forgets that you need to stick with things.
Well, and you said, we thought that when the Berlin Wall came down, we thought that we were establishing a new world order. I talked to Samantha Power about this for her book. And I thought when the Balkans happened, when that kind of sectarian fighting started amongst the former republics of Yugoslavia, I thought that was the end of something, right? But it was it was not that kind of nationalism, that kind of ethnic cleansing was going to happen in lots of places. And you just said before, I think you said, Putin said to unravel the world order, right? I thought we had established a new world order, but I think, it feels like what was really happening was that the world order we had been operating under took about 20 years to unravel. And now we're, I think still, certainly in our country, looking for that organizing principle that people can be united with each other and supporting and not pitted against each other. But
yeah.
I wanted to react to that, but I also want to set the stage with something you talk about early in the book that I think is important for the rest of the conversation, which is that you write about Obama's 2004 speech at the convention. So for those who don't remember, this is when he was running to be United States Senator. This was the red state, blue states, United States speech that really brought him to the nation's attention. And around the same time, Putin gave a speech. Obama sort of offered an explanation for why America had not done better, particularly when it came to race, but how it was possible. Yeah. And in Putin's speech, it's like, I think he told a story about why Russia had faltered, and specifically said, we demonstrated weakness and the weak are beaten. So talk about those two speeches and what you think it sets up and the stories of these of our two countries and conflict between them.
Well, I think that they're connected to the previous comment you made in the sense that the Cold War ends and globalization happens, right? And the countries I look at in this, other than America, are on the other side of the Iron Curtain, right? China, Russia, and Hungary. There's this flood of open markets and capitalism and democracy, and it's just going to wash over the world and kind of water every seed. And what I found in talking to people for this book was the extent to which not only was that disorienting to people, because their kind of traditional identities are getting kind of washed over by this wave of globalization, but that particularly when things started to go bad in certain places, the Iraq War, 9/11, then eventually the financial crisis, people started turning to more traditional forms of identity, nationalism, as a kind of organizing principle for their politics. Yeah. And I go back and
here
I realize,
and elsewhere and everywhere in the world.
Everywhere, right? And so I go back, and it was so interesting to me that Putin and Obama gave these two speeches within a few weeks of each other. And to me, it crystallizes the two paths in front of not just America, but the entire world. Because Obama's speech is basically, this is a story of human progress. And there are all these problems and all these challenges, but at the end of the day, human beings have more in common with one another than their differences. We can overcome racism, we can overcome, but not by pretending like it's not there, but we can do the work, essentially, of forging an inclusive, multiracial, multi-ethnic democracy where everybody can be American and we can solve our problems. And in miniature, that's an argument for what should happen in the world, that people of different nationalities and ethnicities and religions can do the work of trying to work this out. Putin's speech was essentially, it was in the aftermath of an horrific terrorist attack in which scores of children were killed because the school was taken hostage. But the precipitating factor was also that the Russian security forces had just kind of stormed the school shooting and didn't seem to care that in the crossfire were a lot of kids. And what was a horrific event, Putin stands up there and he barely addresses the terrorist attack. He gives a speech instead about basically everything that Russians can have to be angry about. We lost the Soviet Union. We lost the Cold War. We suffered this humiliation at the hands of the West. That then we suffered the humiliation of this kind of corrupt 90s when all these billionaires came in with their Western advisors and kind of took over the resources of the Russian people. Never mind that Putin himself did some of that, but he's speaking to very real grievances, And his answer is basically the old answer, nationalism. We need to return to strong borders, strong national identity. We were weak and the weak were beaten. And I found it such a powerful line. Even when I read it at the time, I got chills because think of like a leader standing up and telling, you'd expect maybe Trump to say that, but
American carnage is what it reminded me.
Yeah, there's this
Trump
kind of
girl.
He's speaking to something real that people felt.
Yeah.
And I think that it sets up, this is where we are in the sense that like it's a relatively new phenomenon that, you try to have democracy, you try to have a democracy that provides rights to people, even if they're of minority backgrounds, that history is basically a story of nationalists who end up fighting wars with each other, or end up building empires. And so what Putin is tapping into and Xi Jinping is tapping into in China and Viktor Orban, who I look at in Hungary, very much tapping into this kind of ethno-nationalism of, I may not, what's so interesting to me about it, Jen, is like one of the Chinese who I talked to for the book, who'd been in Tiananmen Square and lived this from that perspective, was like, the 20th century was about these isms, right? These ideologies, fascism, communism, capitalism, and democracy. 21st century thus far has been about identity. Putin doesn't stand for on an economic vision, right? He's not, Putin and Erdogan and all these guys, even in a way, Xi Jinping, who's nominally a communist, but they stand for power and nationalism. And there's the competition is basically, is that speech that Obama gave, is there still enough of a foothold to push back against that nationalist trend with that kind of more inclusive brand of politics that, all the politicians that you and I have worked for represented. And I think we in America thought, and that particularly we Democrats, well, inevitably, the arc bends in that direction.
Oh, yes, inevitably.
But part of what I'm trying to say in this book is it doesn't. It can if we do the work, but World War I, World War II, like usually like something really bad has to happen before there's then progress. Civil war here in this country. And I hope that we don't have to have further shocks to the system before we get back on a sustainable path.
Right. Yeah. Like maybe having gone through the Great Recession, the financial crisis, the last 4 years of Trump, I feel like we have a second shot at democracy. We've been given a second chance, not that it's by any means in a, safe, but can that be the bad thing that happened that we can come back from now?
COVID too. I mean, I had
COVID. I know one of the Russians thought that could be
there's this
sort of a leveling.
Yeah, well, because what she said, this Russian who I was talking to, is a fascinating woman, Maria Stepanova, and she's a journalist, a poet, a writer. She's just the kind of center of Russian culture and thought in a lot of ways. And she's like, look, the terrible feeling I've had in recent years and watching how aggressive Putin has gotten is that like this kind of stuff tends to lead to wars, right? And I had a similar trepidation even in the Trump show here, because it's like on the one hand, it's like there was some silly thing to think about every day, some weird tweet but then I'm looking around the world and I'm like, well, Xi, Putin, Trump, Modi, like this does not end well. Like these people end up bumping into each other, and she said she lived with this
and
fear,
aligning themselves. Is that what you're worried about?
They're aligning themselves until they end up inevitably in tension, right? Like nationalists end up at war with other nationalists.
Yeah, because you're not fighting over an ideology. I mean, it's weird in that way because there's not really a difference. It's just what's in my personal interest versus yours.
There's really not. It's about power and control, and there's a lot of corruption, obviously, behind it.
Yeah.
And so, what she said is like, look, COVID could be the event that at least forces everybody to stop and take a look at where this is all going. And I think in this country, that's what happened. It was like, and tragically, obviously, you don't want that to happen, and you don't want the terrible loss of life that we suffered. I think what it did, though, is highlight like these people do not know how to govern. These people, the leaders who've done worse in dealing with COVID are generally of this flavor. Donald Trump, Bolsonaro in Brazil, Modi in India, Putin in Russia. And so in this country, I mean, we could have a debate. We don't have to have it here, but like Trump probably gets reelected without COVID.
Agreed. You can stipulate for the purposes of the conversation that happens.
Yeah, which is no commentary on Joe Biden. It's just like he was in a certain position that he, and so we got this second chance in part because the complete bankruptcy of what he was doing was kind of exposed to enough people through the course of that terrible year we all lived through. And I think in other parts of the world, I found even in a place like Hungary, where you've had this kind of consolidation of authoritarian control, like there are signs that the pendulum may be swinging back because of just the frustration with the corruption and the mismanagement of things. And so the hope is, one of the sources of hope, and I think there are many, is that, there's going to be there was a blowback in some extent to globalization, which I write about, but there's potential for the blowback to the blowback here,
Right. Particularly when it is incompetence at that scale, and
corruption at that scale, which pisses people off,
Corruption does piss people off. Yeah. I mean, it's like, it should be. What do you think it means? One of the things you write about is how when you, joined after Obama won in 2008 and you came into the White House and you had this sense of sort of accepting the structural flaws that were in government. This has been my experience too, right? I understood everything wasn't great, but you sort of hope to fix it from within, right? We're going to work to make it a little bit better. The country's, we sort of believed the country was largely on a good trajectory. It was important who was in charge. It was important who was setting the tone. And that, by having the kind of leaders like Obama, you could continue to make progress. It'd be frustrating, but you would continue to do it. And you say that you think it needs a more profound overhaul now. What is it like, and that you were so enraged, that rage was a big motivating factor for you, sort of defining emotion for you for the last 4 years, which I get. Yeah. What do you think the more profound overhaul looks like?
Well, it's funny because like Obama, and you probably heard him use this phrase that I allude to in the book, that the American government at least is like an ocean liner, right?
Yes. Yes.
It takes a while to turn around and point in a new direction. And, we came in after the financial crisis and obviously part of what you're just doing is treating this patient. But I thought about really, you identified at the outset kind of these four big structural areas of American life and society. And I'll try to tick through this as quickly as I can. But you have American capitalism, particularly the kind of post-Reagan strain of unregulated American capitalism that has exploded inequality and opened the door to a lot of corruption, because there's a lot of backdoors and a lot of ways to hide money and a lot of ways to cheat.
Apparently, as we've learned recently with people's income taxes.
Well, and even as Obama reminded me in reading a draft of his book, the financial schemes that led to the financial crisis were legal. The problem is so,
that's why no one went to jail, because
exactly that's what he was saying to me. And so you have this, and what that did though is when the bottom fell out of bra. I mean, that was like in Hungary, like that's when you had this massive right-wing populist backlash that leads to like, it may seem counterintuitive. Why did the populism go to the right instead of the left after the financial crisis? It's because people were so angry at this entire system that this system is designed to screw us. And I'm going to turn to the person who at least reflects my grievances. Because like they almost don't even think that the system can be fixed. And they
don't want you to think the system can be fixed.
They don't want you to think
like Putin and Trump. They just want you to think that you have somebody who can game it for you. And
that's what Navalny said to me is like, what Putin says is not that I'm not corrupted. He says everybody is. So you might as well have someone who's kind of like on your side.
That's what's so corrosive. It's really hard to beat that back.
It's hard to beat that back. And so you have the structural, post Cold War capitalism. You've got the post 9/11 security state, which is this massive infrastructure where we spent over $6 trillion fighting terrorism. When think of what that money could have been put to. But also what I had to wrestle with is the extent to which the post 9/11 national security state not only kind of it diverted our priorities, it was, a framework taken by autocrats. Like counterterrorism is what the Chinese used to justify putting 1 million Uyghurs in concentration camps, or Putin has used to change the laws in Russia, or Orban uses to build like barbed wire fences around Hungary before Trump had the idea. And it created this kind of us versus them kind of xenophobia in this country, where the anger that was once directed at terrorists somehow weirdly became directed at Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton and immigrants in our southern border and Antifa. It's the same cocktail, right? It's
almost as if that was sort of that like drift was destined to happen. And the GWOT, the Global War on Terror, gave people permission, not necessarily permission, but kind of the tools to do it. Or that is how it happened to manifest itself in America. But you think it was always destined to happen?
I think so. When you unleash that degree, I thought about being what is the experience of having been a Fox News viewer throughout the Bush years, where you're being basically promised every single day military victories on par with like World War II. I mean, literally, that was, the Bush is the conqueror and we're going to bring freedom to Iraq and Afghanistan. And then the disorientation of that doesn't happen. Then Barack Obama's president. And when you don't get what you're promised in that kind of, you always look to the enemy within. Well, someone must have screwed this up, like someone must have stabbed us in the back. I mean, it's led to the darkest elements in history, right? But and then you take, so I've got capitalism, security, technology, where, that's the simplest. These new platforms of social media, many from San Francisco, obviously in that area, like are meant to connect and empower people. They then become the perfect tools of disinformation and surveillance before there's any regulatory structure around it. And then race. And I look back at the Obama years and I'm like, we were trying to address all this, right? Like our agenda was very much about trying to deal with inequities in society, provide people with access to healthcare, right? Trying to wind down those post 9/11 wars, like, trying to make technology tools for positive growth and creation and not division. But structurally, we had to make some choices like, We didn't let the patient of the American economy die after the financial crisis. We pumped blood into it, which saved the economy and created a lot of growth and opportunity, but also saved the inequities and saved some of the structural flaws. And on 9/11,
the patient was still who it was before it got sick. It was still an economy that was built, that was geared towards creating a lot of inequality.
Exactly. And in the post 9/11 infrastructure, we never fully extricated ourselves from that being the kind of central project of what America was doing in the world, even as it, became less and less where the world was headed. We were trying to pivot to Asia, and you remember all that. We were trying to do all the things that Biden's trying to do now, focus more on climate, focus more on China. Yeah. But we're constantly pulled back in part by our political forces. And then on technology, I think this thing was like, it wasn't until the 2016 election that people really sobered up to like these platforms are doing more bad than good. That the trade-off suddenly shifted. And on race, I think people took a lot of false comfort in the fact that the president was Black. And so we got the racialized backlash to that without the kind of urgency of addressing racial disparities. Because, so again, through no fault, I like to think I was, self-critical in some areas, but I totally understand why at every given juncture we made choices we did. I think at this point now, though, it's so fundamental that if we don't address, and I'd shorthand it as the inequality in our economics, the post 9/11 national security obsession with the war on terror, the need to put some guardrails around social media, and structural racism, like we're not going to come out of this. Like the opportunity we have is to try to solve these problems and work through this. I think one of the challenges that Democrats and well-meaning Republicans have is that the other side of these debates doesn't want to solve those problems and actually wants to make them worse. Because
the incentive structure on the other side, the partisan side, is entirely different. There is no common ground.
Yeah,
it's not like do they not disagree on anything? It's like the incentive. It's entirely like you can't expect to have compromise with people who are incentivized to do something entirely different than what you're trying to accomplish.
Yeah, if your incentive, just take race. If your incentive is to take any incendiary event that happens, right?
Yeah.
Like there's a fire at a Black Lives Matter protest, and your political incentives are to make that look like a violent riot that can then play in a loop on Newsmax, so you can do TV hits and then introduce resolutions condemning Black lives. Like you're not trying to solve the problem. Like you're trying to make it worse because it benefits you politically. Social media, all their criticism of Twitter and Facebook is not because they earnestly want to solve the problem of disinformation online. It's because they want to intimidate those companies into not solving the problem of disinformation online, because the American far right, takes maximum advantage of their capacity to spread disinformation online. And part of what I wanted to show in the book is that this is not unique to here. This is the exact same thing that a Vladimir Putin does in Russia or Viktor Orban does in Hungary. Like this is the playbook that they're all using. We need to understand that it's one playbook and we need our own playbook to push back.
So the Biden administration seems, it's interesting to me because, these are like a lot of people that we've worked with before. They're really, really experienced. And normally when you go into administration, you want to talk about almost all of your priorities in terms of the economy and how they will help people who are not doing as well, how they're going to help the economy. And these guys, the Biden team does not steer away from putting things in terms of democracy. The theme of this trip to Europe is democracy can deliver. They want to show, right? Because Russia and China want us to believe that the best of the US is in our past. They want to show we can produce vaccines. We can give them to the world. We're going to lead the world in doing that. It was like really, they understood it was really important that they showed that the United States, after we suffered so horribly, could do something big still. They talk about that in terms of trying to pass an infrastructure bill that democracy can deliver, that the Congress can still work, that elections still matter, that whoever gets the most votes needs to be the person that came into power. Do you think, is that the right way to try to achieve what you're like the stakes that you laid out, everything from inequality to dealing with race? Is it like going back to those fundamentals of democracy?
So I think part of this is the benefit, right, of not being in government.
Totally.
You can say exactly what you think, right? So I say this with like every ounce of sympathy possible to people who you and I have sat in the exact same offices and had to make the same tough calls. And by the way, had to reckon with like, there's just things you can't do, right? I mean,
yes.
I would have liked, Obama would have liked to address much more structural inequality. He had no control of Congress after 2 years, right? So with all that said at the beginning, I think it's part of the issue, but there's something much deeper that needs to happen. So their basic argument is that we're going to perform so well that will inevitably lead to a restoration of kind of a democratic equilibrium at home, in a sense that, oh yes, democracies can do stuff in the world. It's not just the Chinese with all their money they're spreading around that can do big things. Weirdly, and I say this with like a ton of, again, all the caveats about sympathy for what they're up against, that's the easy part. Like spending $1 trillion on infrastructure is both very important and necessary and essential, but is actually easier than dealing with why is our society kind of coming apart at the seams. I think that their theory is probably that like, if you are improving people's lives and showing that government can be responsive, then over time, some of the more difficult conversations become easier, or some of the threat of a Trump returning is reduced.
I mean, that has been true in the past, right? In the past, the economy doing a little bit better helps at the margins. And, I don't know, maybe that's enough or maybe it's not. I don't know,
I think so here's what I would say to take it to the next step. I just think that there's two dangers with this. The first danger, frankly, is that some of the stuff that you want to do that is the most consequential is the stuff that gets traded away. I've been watching just these infrastructure negotiations. The corporate tax rate going up, to me, is not just like a pay for. I mean, not to turn this into a wonky conversation. It's about the whole system is unfair. And like people's anger about the system being unfair is something they blame equally on Republicans and Democrats, which is something that you and I might be incredibly frustrated by because, but like if we're not showing that government is aware that people out there feel like they've been getting really screwed. And some of those are like the Obama Trump voter type people. Then I think that, then you're missing an opportunity. That's kind of one smaller point. The bigger point is what's really at stake is like, can a multiracial, multi-ethnic democracy work? Yes. And issues of technology and how we think about social media and how we think about the development of artificial intelligence and the data economy, issues around immigration. And are we a country that welcomes immigrants, and sometimes your political incentives are going to be like to be hard ass on immigration to get through that next election. But like the challenge is if you are constantly kind of taking that short term, like, let's not deal with this issue because it's a little too difficult, like voting rights and immigration. When are you going to deal with it? And meanwhile, the other party is dealing with them every day at the state legislature level, like in their media, like in their massive information ecosystems. And so you got to join the battle here. I mean, I wish this wasn't the case, but we're in a really existential struggle about whether or not this country is going to be a multiracial, multi-ethnic democracy where people have equal opportunity and anybody can be American, no matter what they look like or what they believe. And I just worry that sometimes the smart politics, right?
Yes.
Which I was a part of. Again, I'm not pure as the driven snow here.
We're not casting stones.
Yeah. We're just saying that like, I get, because we, by the way, like I say, make this point in the book, we made the same trade-offs in our foreign policy, right? With China. It was always something like, well, with Obama, we need to get them in the Paris Agreement and we need to get them in the first term to help us deal with the global economy. And Clinton wanted to open up those markets to lower prices and for Americans and to
engage with China, don't let this become another Cold War. Don't let them be in a silo, right? That's like part of what was happening but
democracy was always not the priority. Right. Like if I was trying to looking at us and
not at home or not abroad,
we put out our statements about Tibet, but we don't really do anything about them. We've gone to the mat on trade wars about like soybean purchases from China more than we have about their repressive political system. All I'm saying is that just at home and abroad, democracy has to be the first issue, in my view. And just a democracy delivering isn't the same thing as democracy being the first issue. It's the health of the democracy itself that we have to fight for.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like we realized all of these problems. Did we realize all of the problems too late, or is it, or have we gotten there in time to get at the root of them? Right? We were found on this great idea. We were equal if you were white, a man, and owned land. Right? Like you're still living with, still having not confronted that. Is there a country that is dealing with it better than the U.S.? And by it, I mean, particularly race. It's like a real question. I think there's probably not a country as diverse as the United States.
No. Yeah. Okay. Nobody's as diverse as we are. I mean, our race has been,
these are the kinds of questions I ask my friend Ben Rhodes. So I'm right? With most of us. So like that, I mean, because we're kind of tough in America, but I don't know that it's happening better anywhere else.
Well, here's one thing I would say. This is an interesting thought experiment, which is you'll appreciate. 5 countries that have pretty common traditions because we all kind of come out of the British Empire. The UK, the United States, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada.
Right.
Generally referred to as kind of the Five Eyes, these countries that have this close relationship and intelligence and other things. 3 of those countries have Rupert Murdoch media that kind of dominates.
Wow.
2 of them don't. The United States, the United Kingdom, and Australia have politics that are a complete, utter mess. Like, look at us. UK just had Brexit and has this kind of, I would argue, pretty buffoonish nationalist prime minister. Right. Australia's had like a revolving door of prime ministers, some of whom have been quite out there on the right. And then you have Canada and Justin Trudeau, and New Zealand and Jacinda Ardern, where I'm not suggesting everything is perfect, but like it's a lot better,
Interesting, yeah.
And so part of what I'm getting at is that these are human. These aren't. It's not gravity. I mean,
right.
Like just that example points to the fact that like taking some responsibility for, just the media and the media interaction of media and politics can lead to better outcomes. I think Canada and New Zealand look quite reasonable and are at least actually trying to, and I'm not saying that Trudeau or Jacinda Ardern are perfect, but like they're at least trying to solve these problems and there's having societal dialogues about
and talking
them.
about them up front, that's a good, one of the, this is good, because as it turns out, leadership matters and who's in charge matters. One of the questions we have from the audience is, do you think the current US Congress will be able to regulate social media enough to make it much more difficult for Russian trolls to divide us using these platforms?
I think it's been incredibly challenging. Trying to get legislation that addresses this is going to be incredibly difficult given the differing perspectives on this. But that doesn't make me kind of give, as someone who's kind of looked at this a lot, look, I take a pretty, I look at this as a public health and safety issue at this point where.
Sure was the last year and a half.
Well, yeah, with vaccines and the idea that, there's so many dimensions, but the ones I'll say quickly are like the idea that these platforms are impartial in just the flood of disinformation flowing to people. No, their algorithms have a say, and like Vladimir Putin has figured that out. He knows how to juice the algorithm, whether it's a Facebook feed or even a Google search engine, although I think Google's done better at this. Take Trump's blog. Like, all we've heard is how everybody wanted to know what, the reason Trump did so well is because people wanted that content. Well, no, they didn't. Like, they didn't go to it when they had to go find it. What the algorithm does is it knows that Trump's content gets engagement. So it's going to trigger the right and the left and create the engagement that creates clicks. I don't have to tell San Francisco audiences, but the point is that, you would like there to be some change in how these algorithms are created and some change in the degree of responsibility that companies like particularly Facebook have in removing certain content. I know it's hard, but you know what? Like, so I don't care that it's hard. I care that it's destroying American democracy and that like 40% of my fellow citizens don't seem to live in objective reality. That's a bigger problem than whether it's hard to regulate your algorithm. And I think that even if Congress can't do this, if the US government can agree with some other governments, and I think particularly Europe would be at the forefront of this, and just what are the principles? Like, at least what are we aiming to achieve? And then, by the way, give the companies a chance to self-regulate here. But I think there needs to be some guidance about what are the priorities, what are the responsibilities, what would we like to see happen in terms of improving this space. Anything is better than where we are now.
Yeah, as Kara Swisher says, if Mark Zuckerberg hadn't wanted to be responsible for regulating truth, then he shouldn't have created a platform that required it.
Yeah, exactly.
Like we forget. I think people forget that Facebook is a private company. It's not. There are not constitutional rights to being heard on Facebook. They can stop whoever they want.
Yeah, and I don't know that free speech had in mind automated Russian trolls speech. Right. I don't.
You have to adapt.
Yeah, like that's not the same thing as someone like saying their opinion. In this country.
It's weird that my stepdaughter wanted me to ask this question. Why didn't Russia do much to prop up Trump's blog? It's kind of funny, right? Like, why didn't they take the content from the blog and try to get more shares in the platform? It's funny.
I mean, it's funny, but at the same time, I think, and again, I look, one of the things I want to communicate in this book is how incidental Trump is to all this. Yeah. And that sounds strange, but like, I think the Russians are much more like, how can we get QAnon in front of more and more Americans? How can they're trying to drive us insane?
They've moved beyond. Yes.
Yeah, like they're into like how can we create divisions within certain communities? Trump is going to be Trump, and he's going to do what he's going to do, and the entire Republican Party, basically, with a very small number of exceptions, kind of deciding that this guy who we never hear from is still like the Wizard of Oz behind the curtain. What more work do you have to do? The Republican Party does it for you, if you're Putin, right? And what I think, but that's almost scarier to realize that this isn't just an effort to like install, Trump. It's an effort to kind of turn America into the worst version of ourselves.
Right. Because that's what the original goal was, right? That's what was found. The original goal was just make people of the Russian interference in 2016 was just make Americans doubt democracy, be unsettled, be at war with each other. And kind of hit the jackpot with him actually winning. They did.
And they did too, because another thing I kind of go into in the book, is like conspiracy theory is very important to this. Like the Russians, conspiracy theory, like Navalny told me, like part of the strategy against him in terms of disinformation campaigns has been, there's a whole argument that he's an enemy of the Russian state, but there was a whole argument online that he was actually a double agent, an FSB agent. Of course, the Russian government would have every incentive to make the leading oppositionist to Putin out to be a Putin agent, right? And conspiracy theory makes people think that they figured something out, and just sends them down a rabbit hole where they no longer have agency because they're living in the conspiracy theory, And so I think it's not a coincidence that like Russian efforts have focused on, I think, juicing conspiracy theories, and they hit pay dirt with Trump because the guy has like the mind of someone who's done 5 minutes of research about a conspiracy theory online and thinks he knows all the answers,
Right. Another question from the audience. Do you think President Biden being in office will change the trajectory of nationalism and authoritarianism globally? And let me add to that. What do you see when you look at elections happening abroad? Macron run in France. You have Johnson in the UK. Merkel hung on for a long time in Germany, but like, what do you see as we won here? What do you think portends?
I think it's so. I think obviously Joe Biden's election was great for it was like the second chance in a way, and the way I describe this, I kind of, one of the hopeful notes I end on, and I wasn't just trying to talk myself into it, is, the title of the book is
I'm glad to know.
Yeah. Well, and the title of the book is After the Fall. And in a way, like we are fallen in the eyes of the world in the sense that like, we're just like everybody else. Like it can happen here. Like we can have the corrupt autocrat with the son-in-law down the hall and the mob storming the parliament. Like, guess what? People, that happens a lot in other places. What's exceptional about us is the story we tell about ourselves, and that's still something that is exceptional. But the opportunity is that having kind of become more recognizable, if we can fight through it, then I do think that ripples out around the world. Because it's one thing to sit up on a high mountaintop as a superpower and tell people to become democracies. It's another when they see you like fighting back the crowd on January 6th and pushing back against the Trump and getting him out of office. So we have this opportunity.
Right.
And I think Joe Biden is a great, Jen, I don't know what you like as someone who'd been on a campaign and someone who's kind of watched some of this trajectory, when he described himself as a bridge, I thought that was such a brilliant, I don't know if that was something that they had a meeting about, but it seemed
true, right?
It's so true. Like, but he can be he's not going to solve all these problems. No one person could. A charismatic, once in a generation talent like Barack Obama couldn't solve all these problems. But
right.
Joe Biden may be the right bridge in the sense that he can calm a bunch of people down, not everybody. He can kind of speak to some people that we were about to lose them forever and bring enough of them back to survive a couple of election cycles. And he can try to kind of begin to fortify like Democratic backbone and hopefully at the same time that there's this kind of regeneration from below at the grassroots, because essentially what needs to happen is I think we all need to care about these things. Like everybody in America has to become like Stacey Abrams in a way. Like this, we can't just like leave this to the federal government or wait for Joe Manchin to change his mind. It's like, if you don't like that, then get out and do something and organize something where you are, or run for office where you are, or like get involved in something where you are, or change the culture. Like Black Lives Matter, people may say like, well, look, the polls are down for that. No, but they're changing the culture, and the cultural change leads to political change, right? So I think people have agency. And in terms of globally, I think there's like, it's very unsettled, but it does feel like there's more momentum in the Democratic world towards like the pendulum swinging back. I would watch, if you want to watch kind of for indicators, because you can saw it, by the way, in Israel, where a truly bizarre government emerged, but the unifying factor is like, this guy is kind of becoming a little too autocratic and corrupt. And we just need to get him out of here.
You describe Putin as a late stage corrupt.
Exactly. It feels like the last of something. But, Orban has an election next year in Hungary. He's been at the vanguard of this trend. If he can be beaten, that would be huge. Brazil, where there's like been a really Trumpian nationalist, he's going to be running for re-election next year. There's some big elections coming up. And what I find out there is the most hopeful trend is younger people actually running for office, starting political parties, most often young women. And so there've been a few different women in their late 30s, early 40s, literally becoming prime ministers in Europe. That makes you hopeful, and in
the United States, there's a lot of young people running for office at lower levels, which is really important, right? Don't just jump to Congress. It's the state legislators, it's the city councils. That's like, it's got to be at every level.
And that's who Biden is a bridge to, those people.
You can be a bridge, and I think it can be, and I think it can be transformational. An older white president could stand in Tulsa and name the members of the United States Senate that had been in the Ku Klux Klan. Yeah. An older white man can do that in a way that a Black president can't,
And that's the thing is I get this question, a couple of times of like, well, isn't it easier for an older white man to raise some of these things? And I was like, well, yeah, but that's not like the long-term answer, like that.
That's the bridge.
Yeah, exactly. That's why it's just a bridge, because like we shouldn't just say, oh, wait a second, like it was too big of a racialized backlash to that Black president, and running
right. Or also with something that strikes close to my heart, there wasn't too much of a backlash against the woman.
Yeah. Well, even
so
bigger,
we can't do that.
You could argue even bigger backlash, right? And so like. That's like, while we have to live in those realities, if we're in politics, like doesn't mean you have to be accepting of them, but you want to get to the place where the identity of the gender or ethnicity or, whatever it is, identity of the person, it shouldn't be the requirement to clear some bar, but like, we're not there yet, and we have to recognize that. And that's a reason to do the work, though, not to give up.
All right, we have some more questions. Do you think the outspokenness of Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Ilhan Omar, and the younger congressional delegate Democrats in being more critical of Israel signals a generational change in Democratic foreign policy?
1,000,000%. And people like me have been warning of this for like over a decade, that like when Bibi Netanyahu did the full embrace of the Republican Party, the full embrace of Donald Trump, moved this further and further to the right, gave up on a Palestinian state. What did you think was going to happen? I mean, young people care about justice and structural inequity, and they're not going to carve out this one issue because it's a very difficult one to address. And the other thing I'd say is I was struck when I traveled to other countries, Jen, like AOC is a global figure. Like
Wow.
they know her, they follow her. Like if you're like a young activist in Europe
cool.
or in Southeast Asia, like, so they're connected to kind of a global movement on this and other issues that are like justice issues to people. They're not
And
just
it's a woman. That's never happened before.
yeah, and that's never happened. It's a woman of color, and so yeah, I think that is going to create like a real debate in the party. Netanyahu being gone doesn't solve that, but at least creates an opportunity to have like the discussion with a different cast of Israeli characters. Yeah.
What do you think the eventual outcome of Brexit will be, and how do you think of it in the context of the recent rise of nationalism?
I think it's a case in point, and it kind of makes cameos in my book. But like to me, the slogan for Brexit was one of the most powerful political slogans of the 21st century: is "Take back control." It was like simultaneously angry and I'm not hopeful, but like at least we're gonna
agency though.
Agency,
right?
exactly,
Yeah.
agency. Like, and it can be about immigration, it can be about Brussels bureaucrats, can be about white supremacy too. It can be about a lot of different things, and it grows very, I think, out of this momentum that nationalism has had over the last decade. I still think it's a negative. I just in part because there's a lot of reasons why. I mean, I think one, just for the UK, now they're going to have problems. The Scots won out, and nationalism for a United Kingdom that is made up of a number of different countries. Mm-hmm. Nationalism is a hard thing to limit to like the particularly English nationalism that led to Brexit. So I think they're going to have problems in negotiating what is their relationship to Europe. They're going to have problems. What is the future for Northern Ireland and Scotland? And the democratic world just benefited, I think, from a stronger Europe that included the UK. It is what it is, and I get it. I hope that in the long run, though, the best outcome would be the closer that relationship is between the UK and the European Union, I think the better for all involved. Because be careful what you wish for. If it's basically like, well, we got back control, but like we lost the United Kingdom, we lost our connection to Europe, and we're less influential in the world, I don't think that's a prize. So I think they need to figure out how to still plug into the same institutions that they extricated themselves from.
I mean, the fact that it took them so long to even figure it out. I mean, and two prime ministers. I mean, we're on our third, right? Trying to figure it out. So it suggests that it's not easy to disentangle. Another question. POTUS said he wants to. I like hearing that and knowing that the reference is to Joe Biden and not Donald Trump. It's good. Yeah. First, because the first year you're in office, I still feel the need to say President Biden it's just the president. So POTUS said he wants to discuss swapping prisoners with Putin, and Putin is interested. What prisoners might be impacted by this? It sounds like something out of an episode of The Americans. We kind of jumped the shark of The Americans plot. If you
we did, we season we started. They stopped having to do the show because we were just living it. I saw these reports. I mean, look, there's kind of different...
that's such a. I just have to pause and say, like, that's such a White House spokesperson thing to say. I've seen the reports. And now I'm not going to comment on them.
No, I'll comment on them. I mean, what are we talking about here? Like, so, like Biden is interested in Russia no longer having itself be this kind of safe haven for, ransomware attacks and cyber attacks. So there's the criminals who are carrying out those attacks. Then there are also these Americans who are imprisoned in Russia who didn't really do anything wrong. A couple of Americans who've been, basically wrong place, wrong time, wrapped up by the Russian authorities. And God only knows who Putin's talking about. I mean, there's probably some collection of arms dealers and the like. So I get a little wary when we start talking about prisoner swaps to the Russians, because no, we don't want them to swap prisoners. We want them to no longer allow every hacker in the world to just, like try to cripple America's critical infrastructure.
Right.
Like, so I think a prisoner
we
swap
shouldn't be in the hole here. Like we were.
We're not in the hole. I mean, I say this as someone who's negotiated a prisoner swap with Cuba, but actually did it as part of a much bigger transformation of relations, where the prisoner swap was like the entry point to being able to change the whole relationship. So look, I mean, if this is a minimalist thing where Biden can get those couple of Americans out of prison without having to release some super Russian criminal, okay, I'd like that for those American families, of course. I don't know that exchanging cyber criminals the point is not to swap a couple of criminals. It's that you want them to change their behavior. And the last time Putin raised something like this, he requested that Trump give him Mike McFaul, like a former ambassador who they said had committed crimes. Right? So that's why like Putin sometimes proposes things as a troll. Maybe there's something real this time, but I think
to take back the narrative of the meeting, right?
And set the narrative of the meeting. So that's why I did I've seen the reports, because I'm curious who Putin has in mind. And again, I think people should bear in mind what Biden wants is for them to change their behavior more than they want to, turn over this one hacker,
Right. We have a lot of good questions. While writing this book, was there any one thing people in other countries told you they wanted Americans to know about them or the world outside the U.S.?
Oh, it's a really interesting question.
Yeah.
About them.
About them, yeah.
Yeah, so not about us. I think one of the most powerful things that somebody said to me was Hong Kong, because I obviously went there as an American. I carried my baggage. I'm an American. So I see this in part through the prism of the American-Chinese Communist Party competition conflict.
Right.
And I found it incredibly hopeful. Like here's, we keep hearing how good this Chinese model is, and yet here's this whole city where people could opt in and they want to opt out. They clearly didn't want to be swallowed up by China. And I associate that with kind of freedom and democracy. And the story they basically told me is like, look, the encroachment in our lives of China has been multifaceted for a long time now, where it's like, first it's like, you're not supposed to say certain things about politics. Then it's like, you shouldn't post certain things on social media. If you want to get a job, you want to get in a good school. Then it's like, don't even go to certain websites because they're monitoring that too. Don't even put anything in email. And the totality of like, don't do this if you want to get ahead in society begins to eat away at your identity. And then they're changing the curriculum in schools. And so I went there, you guys want democracy. And what I mainly heard from them is one of them said, I was like, what do you really want at the end of the day? Like, what do you want? And he's like, we want to be left alone to figure out who we are. Like the British ruled us. Then the British and the Chinese made a deal where we give them back to the Chinese. We felt Chinese, but we're not really obviously like them in a lot of ways in terms of our system. And now we're kind of caught between the Americans and the Chinese. And I thought it was such a powerful expression of like, at its core, people just want to be left to figure out who they are without big, powerful systems coming in, and made me see the Hong Kong protest movement in a slightly different way, that it's about democracy, but it's also about identity. It's about like, hey, we feel like we're Hong Kongers. We don't feel like we're citizens of the Chinese Communist Party, nor do we feel like we want to be like the front lines of American pushback for democracy. Like, and I think that it was a good lesson for me of like, at the end of the day, like one way of thinking about freedom is just like that. Freedom is supposed to be your ability to just figure it out for yourself, And yeah, so that was, that stuck with me.
Okay. So we're at our last question because we're out of time.
Oh, yeah.
And I'm going to pull it's going to be like I'm a network White House correspondent where I have a 3-part question.
Yes. Jeff Mason. Yeah.
So the last audience we have the last question from the audience is what gave you the most hope during your journey in writing the book? And then what I want to know, is you had this really interesting passage about a woman, like an innkeeper in West Virginia, who was one of the famed Obama-Trump voters that you ended up sort of stumbling upon a conversation about politics with her reluctantly. You all managed to be civil and, try and see past these political differences. But it's like, there's not so much of what divides us is not real. It's made up.
Yeah.
She thought all of this crazy stuff about Benghazi that is not true. That's what upset her. The things that upset her weren't true.
Yeah.
And and the final piece of this is that you have a great part in the book where you talk about President Obama's speech in Selma, 50th anniversary of Selma, and Bloody Sunday, and talking about putting the anecdote about Jackie Robinson stealing home.
Yeah.
And how stealing home, first Black baseball player in Major League Baseball. And that just sort of like underdog gumption that it takes to steal home. Like, why is that an American thing? And what gave you, is that what gives you hope? What gives you hope during this?
Yeah. I mean, I think so. The West Virginia voter was an interesting experience for me because we ended up talking about Benghazi. And the short version is like, I had a conversation with her before she knew who I really was. And so she was kind of sharing, like what I would say, conspiracy theories about me. And I'm kind of warning her, hey, I'm a character. And then the next day when we see each other,
you knew who I was,
I said that to her,
like me.
And we had this lovely experience the next day where she was apologetic. So then I was apologetic for some reason. And then we kind of embraced and she was a lovely and a nice person. But Jen, like, I guess like the reason that anecdote is so powerful is because I'm reflecting on it. I'm like, well, but she believes until she met me, she thought I was someone totally different because there's this massive machinery meant to tell her that. And one of the things I write about that like you would understand is that I guess I've become like something of not an outlier because I'm like, like the rest of us, I'm on MSNBC and I'm doing podcasts, but like, I guess I don't know if I'm wrong about this, but like been seen to be increasingly kind of, I don't know if angry is the right word or, but like I just fundamentally, since this started happening to me, since I started being in the conspiracy theories, kind of in the second term, kind of around when you were communications director, those things are not related. I found it so upsetting to be told kind of by a certain Washington mentality that I need to kind of get in a room with these people and who don't live in reality. Like I'm wrong about plenty. It's not that I think I'm so great. Like I'm wrong. I'm sure I've been wrong about a ton of stuff. Like I'm sure my batting average is the same as anybody who's in tough jobs and in politics. But like I want to like know that we are living in the same.
But you're reality. A good person. You're like coming from a good place.
And not even just
like,
that.
And you're like living in reality.
I'm just living. There's facts. That. Yeah. Like so to me, like that was a core. It was both the hope and the problem. The hope is this is a nice woman, and we do share things as Americans, and we can sit down and have a good experience together. The challenge is, through no fault of her own, I honestly believe, like she just lives in an information ecosystem that has her believing stuff that isn't true. And that to me is the core of the challenge in this country is like, can enough people live in reality? There are always going to be people who like want to believe weird stuff. I'd say for the hope, look around the world, I'm meeting these people who are in much more difficult circumstances than ours in Hong Kong and in Russia, and who are like risking it all, putting it on the line. Like my hope is that I went around the world and found that like, they're more of us than them. Like that if people don't give up and people don't succumb to apathy and cynicism and people mobilize and people understand, by the way, that movements don't succeed at first. Like, like you fail and fail and fail and fail, and then you break through and things change and things open up. Like that's how Georgia is responsible basically for the fact that we have a chance at democracy in this country. It's because people work there. If you do the work, you can get this done. And that kind of I ended the book on this kind of radical idea that Obama had. It wasn't that radical, but I realized it was more radical than I thought at the time, where he's like giving this speech at the anniversary of Selma. And he's like, I want you to come up with the list of Americans who are not in the canon, but who are emblematic of the underdog story. Right. And so me and Cody Keenan, like the other speechwriter, who was the lead speechwriter, like got to sit down and have this fun experience of like, Langston Hughes and Sojourner Truth and and even Emerson and Thoreau and the people who made up jazz and the women's rights movement and like anybody who could be assembled from the cast of American history who was an outsider, a minority, a change maker. We just kind of name check these people with details about them. And it kind of, to me, reclaimed this idea that like America is at its best when we think like the underdog. We think like we're the people that have been counted out, or we're the people that, we're not at our best when we're like, the global hegemon. We're at our best when we're like fighting through it. And Jackie Robinson, I was one of the ones I proposed, in part because it was so identified with Obama, of the person who goes first and therefore has to do everything, twice as well in terms of his behavior. But then I thought like this idea, like this most famous thing he did is stealing home base in the World Series. It may sound like a tangent, but I was like, what an American thing, because like that's like not against the rules, but you're not really, it's against the logic of the game. And I was like, well, what's more American than some guy, the first black player, getting to third and figuring out a way to beat, can get one over on the system, And that kind of spirit didn't come out of nowhere. That was informed by decades of kind of Negro League baseball, and people have been kept out who just like were honing their skills, waiting for that chance to be on third base and make that run home. And that to me that's the hopeful note I end on, because it's like, I think that's what America is. Like, I think we are the country, all these underdogs I'm talking to around the world, we have to be a part of that. We have to connect to that. And when we do that, like pretty amazing stuff tends to happen, whether it's culturally or politically. And I think that's, that's the hope. And that's what America's supposed to be.
I'm going to read just like the last part of that, because I thought it was just so good, man. Existing structures and inexhaustible grievances will present their own barriers, but there remains the opportunity afforded by each cycle of history to carefully watch the windup of a pitcher slowed by complacency and a sense of supremacy, to pause for a moment and feel the sum total of experience and brazen belief that propels the underdog's dash toward home.
That's it.
USA.
Yeah, exactly. Right?
USA. Yeah. Seriously. It's so, that is.
That's what we're supposed to be about. Yeah.
That is. And each of us matters in this moment. So, all right. We are way over time.
Sorry about that.
But no, it was me. I mean, I had lots of questions. I had lots of questions I didn't get to. Someday I'll see you in person. We can talk to you more about it, but congratulations and thank you. This was really great.
Thanks so much. It was great catching up.
It was. It's good to hit up.
Yeah.